When we speak of Kyivan Rus, we often picture Slavic tribal chieftains, wooden fortresses perched above the Dnipro, and princes vying for power. But few people know, or choose to ignore, that the first rulers of Rus were not Slavs, but Scandinavians. Vikings, the very same warriors who raided England's coasts, sailed to Iceland, and traded with the Arab world. The story of Rus begins not in Kyiv, but on the cold shores of the Baltic Sea. In the 9th century, the Varangians, what the Slavs called Scandinavian warriors, began to penetrate the territory of modern-day Ukraine. They weren't merely raiders. They sought control over trade routes. The most important of these was the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a waterway connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea via rivers, lakes, and portages. Kyiv, situated on the Dnipro River, became a strategic hub, and it was here that the Varangians established themselves, transforming the city into the capital of a new state. According to the Primary Chronicle, in 862 the Slavic tribes invited a Varangian named Rurik to rule over them. This wasn't just legend. It marked the beginning of a dynasty that would govern Rus for over 7 centuries. Rurik was a Scandinavian, and his successors, Oleg, Iyer, Ol, Sviatoslav, continued the Varangian legacy. They didn't just wage war. They built cities, forged diplomatic treaties, and baptized Rus. Scandinavian sagas support this version of events. In the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, Prince Volodymyr is mentioned as being persuaded by the Norwegian king to adopt Christianity. The saga describes events that appear differently in Rus Chronicles, which emphasize Byzantium. This raises a question. Was Constantinople's role exaggerated to divert attention from Scandinavian influence? Archaeology also speaks in favor of the Varangians. In Kyiv, Novgorod, and Ladoga, Scandinavian jewelry, weapons, and coins have been unearthed. Viking-style burial rituals have been identified, and genetic studies show that part of the modern population carries markers typical of northern peoples. So why did this version of history remain in the shadows for so long? There are many reasons. In the 19th century, as Russian imperial historiography took shape, the idea of a foreign origin for Rus clashed with the national myth. During Soviet times, the Normanist theory was labeled bourgeois and unscientific. And even today, in the era of independence, the topic remains sensitive because it challenges long-held beliefs about the origins of statehood. But facts are stubborn things. The history of Rus is a history of cultural, linguistic, and bloodline fusion. The Varangians were not invaders. They became part of this land, its rulers, its architects. And it's time to tell that story honestly. Imagine this: a cold fjord, a wooden longship, axe-wielding men setting off into the unknown. This isn't a scene from a TV series. It's the historical reality of the 9th century. The Vikings, known in Rus as the Varangians, were not mere raiders. They were traders, diplomats, colonizers. And they were the ones who laid the foundation for what would become Kyivan Rus. The Scandinavian world of that era was dynamic and brutal. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, not centralized states, but a mosaic of clans competing for resources. Vikings ventured out not only in search of plunder, but also new lands, trade partners, and political influence. Their routes spanned all of Europe, from Ireland to the Caspian Sea. The eastern direction, what the Scandinavians called Ostervägar, was especially alluring. Through the Baltic Sea, the Neva River, Ladoga, Folkhof, and onward to the Dnipro. This route led to wealthy Byzantium, where furs, slaves, honey, and wax could be traded. But to control this path, they needed to settle. And so, the Varangians began building outposts, first in Ladoga, then in Novgorod, and eventually in Kyiv. The Varangians were not a homogeneous group. Among them were Norwegians, Swedes, Danes. They held pagan beliefs, worshipped Odin, Thor, Freya. Their culture was deeply martial, yet remarkably organized. They had laws, traditions, and a system of honorific titles. When they arrived in Slavic lands, they didn't simply impose their rule, they integrated creating a new political model. Interestingly, the very term Rus has Scandinavian roots. Most scholars believe it derives from ror, meaning rowing. In Finnish languages, Ruotsi still refers to Sweden. This isn't just a linguistic footnote. It's a trace of Scandinavian presence embedded in the name of the state itself. The Varangians quickly adapted to local conditions. They married Slavic women, adopted local customs, yet retained their military organization. This blend, a Slavic populace and a Scandinavian elite, became the basis for princely rule. Rurik, invited to govern, was not just a leader. He was a symbol of a new order. Modern research confirms the Scandinavian origin of the Varangians. Archaeologists uncover swords, jewelry, and coins with clear Northern European provenance. Viking-style burial rituals, cremation, stone circles, weapons as status symbols, are found in graves. Geneticists detect markers indicating a mix of Scandinavian and Slavic lineages. But perhaps most fascinating is how the Varangians transformed. They began as outsiders, but became princes. Their culture merged with the local one, creating a unique synthesis we now call Kyivan Rus. And though textbooks often mention them in passing, without emphasis, it was the Varangians who set the machinery of statehood in motion. This isn't just a story about Vikings. It's a story about how an external impulse can forge a new civilization, how foreigners can become founders, and how truth, buried for centuries, finally returns. In the medieval world, where roads were perilous and forests impenetrable, rivers served as the main arteries of movement. And it was these waterways that became the foundation for the emergence of Kyivan Rus. The most famous among them, the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, was more than a path. It was an economic system, a political strategy, and a geographic logic that united North and South, Varangians and Slavs, the Baltic Sea and Byzantium. The route began in Scandinavia, passed through the Baltic Sea, the Neva River, Lake Ladoga, the Fokhof, Lake Ilmen, the Lovat River, portages to the Dnipro, and onward to the Black Sea. It was a complex yet efficient system that allowed the Varangians to transport goods, conduct diplomacy, and exert territorial control. Kyiv, located on the Dnipro, became a crucial node, and that's precisely why the Varangians made it their capital. What was transported along this route? Everything of value in the medieval world. Furs, honey, wax, slaves, silver, jewelry, weapons. From the north came resources, from the south, luxury. Byzantium was the key partner, an empire that needed raw materials and offered gold, textiles, and wine in return. The Varangians didn't merely trade. They negotiated treaties, such as the famous agreement between Prince Oleg and Byzantium in 911, which guaranteed safety and favorable conditions for Rus merchants. But this route was not only economic, it held strategic importance. Control over rivers meant control over regions. The Varangians built outposts, fortifications, collected tribute. They didn't just sail, they settled, integrated, and established administrative systems. Thanks to this route, Rus evolved from a tribal confederation into a centralized state. Remarkably, this route was known far beyond Rus. Era geographers like Ibn Fadlan described the Rus as tall, fair-haired warriors trading along the Volga. Frankish chronicles mention Normans appearing in Eastern markets. This points to the global nature of Rus trade, and to the Varangians as part of a vast Eurasian network. Archaeology confirms the existence of this route. In Ladoga, Novgorod, Smolensk, and Kyiv, Scandinavian artifacts, coins, and jewelry have been found. At portage sites, remnants of boats and traces of transport activity remain. This is no legend. It's material reality that speaks for itself. But most importantly, this route created Rus as an idea. It united North and South, Varangians and Slavs, economy and politics. Without it, Kyiv would not have become a capital, princely authority would not have emerged, and Rus would not have become a state. Though today it's mentioned only briefly in textbooks, this route was the backbone on which our history was built. In 862, according to the Chronicle, the Slavic tribes turned to the Varangians with a plea. Our land is vast and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us. This moment remains one of the most enigmatic in our history. Who were these Varangians? Why were they invited? And how did they transform from outsiders into founders of state? The name Rurik stands at the beginning of a dynasty that would rule Rus for over 7 centuries. His origins were Scandinavian, likely from the region of modern-day Sweden. He did not come alone. Warriors, advisors, and merchants accompanied him. They settled in Ladoga and later in Novgorod, where Rurik established his authority. This was not mere military control. It was a political structure that quickly took on the features of statehood. After Rurik's death, his relative Oleg, called the Prophet in the Chronicle, assumed power. In 882, he made one of the most pivotal moves. He seized Kyiv and declared it the capital of Rus. This act was more than a shift of center. It was a strategic decision that united North and South, Varangians and Slavs, commerce and politics. Oleg signed a famous treaty with Byzantium, securing rights for Rus merchants in Constantinople. It was the first international act of Rus, and it was signed by a Varangian. His successor, Iyer, continued the work but was killed while collecting tribute. His widow, Princess Ol, became one of the most influential figures of the era. She reformed the administrative system, introduced a taxation structure, and was the first ruler of Rus to adopt Christianity. Her son, Sviatoslav, was a warrior in the true Viking style. He led campaigns along the Volga, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. His rule was direct, harsh, uncompromising. He built no palaces. He lived in a camp like a soldier. His death, an ambush on the Dnipro, marked the symbolic end of the Varangian expansion. But it was his son, Volodymyr the Great, who completed the transformation. He baptized Rus, built churches, and consolidated power. Though often portrayed as a Slavic prince, his lineage was Varangian. He was a descendant of Rurik, an heir to the Scandinavian tradition adapted to the Slavic context. This dynasty, the Rurikids, became the foundation of Rus statehood. They were not accidental rulers. They created a system, administration, military, diplomacy. And although the Varangian origin gradually faded, its traces remained in names, in laws, in culture. Today, when we speak of Rus, we often forget that its first princes were Varangians. But this does not diminish its Slavic essence. On the contrary, it shows how different cultures can create something new. The Varangians did not destroy the Slavic world. They organized it, structured it, elevated it to the level of a state. The story of Rurik and his descendants is not merely a chronicle of power. It is a story of integration, transformation, and synthesis. And it deserves to be told without myths, without ideology, honestly, as it truly was. History is not just about facts. It's also about how those facts are recorded. And when we compare the Rus Chronicles with the Scandinavian sagas, a fascinating picture emerges. The same events are described differently, with different emphases, heroes, and even motivations. These aren't mere discrepancies. They are two parallel narratives that sometimes contradict each other, but together offer a deeper understanding of who the Varangians were and what role they played in the history of Rus. The Rus Chronicles, especially the Primary Chronicle, were written in monastic settings with a clear purpose: to present Rus as a Christian, Slavic state developing under Byzantine influence. The Varangians are mentioned, but briefly. Their role is almost technical. They arrived, established order, and handed over power. From there, the story becomes entirely Slavic. Christianity comes from Byzantium. Culture is local. The Varangian influence is downplayed. Scandinavian sagas tell a very different story, written in Iceland, Norway, and Denmark, often centuries after the events. They preserved oral traditions. In these texts, Rus is a land where Scandinavian heroes act. For example, in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, Prince Volodymyr is persuaded by Olaf to adopt Christianity. The saga describes how the Norwegian king sends a bishop to Kyiv, negotiates, and influences the prince's decision. This contradicts the Rus Chronicle, where Byzantium plays the central role. Another example is the Saga of Aymund, which depicts conflicts between Rus princes from the perspective of Scandinavian mercenaries fighting for one of the contenders. The saga provides names, motivations, even battle descriptions, details absent from Rus sources. And while these texts often carry legendary elements, they include specifics that archaeology confirms. Interestingly, the sagas refer to Rus as Gardariki, the realm of cities. This suggests that Scandinavians saw Rus as a developed territory, with urban centers, trade, and politics. They didn't view it as a wild frontier, but as a partner, a stage for action. The differences between sagas and chronicles are not just stylistic. They reflect distinct ideologies. The chronicle aims to portray Rus as a successor to Byzantium. The saga sees it as part of the Scandinavian world. And in this tension lies the key to understanding why the Varangian role was diminished. Byzantine influence was politically advantageous, especially during the Christianization era. But when we read these sources together, as mirrors of one another, a deeper picture emerges. The Varangians were not a footnote. They were actors, diplomats, warriors, rulers. And while Rus history later followed its own path, its beginnings were shaped by a Scandinavian impulse, preserved in sagas, but muted in chronicles. Today, with access to both sources, we can finally see the full picture. And it's more complex, more intriguing, more dramatic than we were told. This is not just a story about Rus. It's a story about how memory is shaped and how it can be reclaimed. In debates about the origins of Kyivan Rus, one phrase often echoes, "It's just a theory." But when an archaeologist's spade sinks into the earth, theories collide with facts. And those facts speak clearly. The Varangians were here, not as myth, not as legend, but as real people with real objects, leaving traces that endure even after 1,000 years. Let's start with the graves. In Ladoga, Novgorod, Kyiv, and Chernihiv, burial sites have been found with unmistakable Scandinavian features. Cremation, a ritual uncommon among Slavs of that era. Stone circles surrounding the burial site. Swords, axes, fibulae, jewelry, all typical of Viking culture. Some graves even contain ship elements, reminiscent of the famous burials in Oslo and Gokstad. One of the most striking examples is the burial complex at Gnezdovo near Smolensk. Over 400 mounds have been discovered there, and many are clearly Scandinavian in type. Some contain swords inscribed with runes. Others hold ornaments with direct analogues in Sweden. This is not mere influence, it's physical presence. Archaeologists also uncover Scandinavian coins. For instance, Arab dirhams that reached Rus through Scandinavian trade. More Arab coins have been found in Sweden than in Arabia itself, a testament to the scale of exchange. In Kyiv, the same coins appear, the same trade networks. This confirms that Rus was part of a vast Scandinavian Arab commercial system. Now, genetics. In the 21st century, scientists began analyzing DNA from ancient burials. And in some, notably in Ladoga, they found markers typical of Scandinavian populations. These are Y chromosome haplogroups uncommon among Slavs, but prevalent in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. This suggests that part of Rus population, at least its elite, had Scandinavian origins. Interestingly, these markers have partially persisted in modern populations of northern Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. This doesn't mean we're all descendants of Vikings, but it does mean their genetic imprint is real, measurable, and scientifically confirmed. Another piece of evidence, toponyms. In certain regions, place names with Scandinavian roots have survived. River names, settlements, even personal names in chronicles, all point to a cultural presence that was not superficial, but deep. Archaeology and genetics cannot be rewritten. Chronicles can be interpreted, sagas can be doubted, but a sword in the ground is a fact. And these facts say, the Varangians were here. They lived, fought, traded, ruled. And their legacy is not only in history, but in the soil, in the bones, in the genes. This is not just confirmation of the Normanist theory. It's a rethinking, because when legend becomes archaeology, it ceases to be legend. And then, the history of Rus takes on new contours, not as an isolated Slavic state, but as part of a vast Scandinavian world stretching from fjords to steppes. We're used to thinking of history as something frozen, carved in stone. But in truth, history is alive. It shifts when we ask new questions, uncover new sources, and view old fact from new angles. The history of Kyivan Rus is exactly that, unfinished, evolving. And the truth about the Varangians who helped found it is not a mere detail. It's a key to understanding how states, cultures, and identities are formed. To acknowledge that the first princes of Rus were Scandinavians is not to deny Slavic roots. It's to recognize that statehood is always a synthesis, that outsiders can become insiders, that power may arrive from beyond, but transform into something deeply local. This is not weakness, it's strength, because real history is always complex. This truth matters because it breaks myths. The myth of a pure national lineage. The myth of autochthony as the only form of legitimacy. The myth that the foreigner is always a threat. The Varangians show us something else. A foreigner can be a founder, can be a leader, can become part of us. In today's world, where identity often becomes a battleground, this story is a breath of fresh air. It reminds us that the past is not a collection of flags, but a web of connections. That states arise not from purity, but from interaction. And that our history is no less rich than any other. It's also a challenge to education. It's time to revise textbooks, time to include sagas, archaeology, genetics. Time to show children that history is not a list of dates, but a living process of seeking truth. And that truth, even when uncomfortable, is always more valuable than a convenient lie. And finally, it's an opportunity, a chance to rethink who we are, not as descendants of mythical tribes, but as heirs to a layered, multifaceted history, where Varangians are not enemies, but founders, where Rus is not isolated, but open, where truth is not a threat, but a foundation for the future. Because only when we accept that our history is complex do we become mature. And only then can we build something new, grounded in truth, in memory, in what was, and what we're ready to embrace. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this story.